Welcome back to Southeast Asia Radio. Today, we'll cover Singapore's recent oil spill and Thailand and Malaysia's desire to join BRICS, an international group of emerging economies.
We'll also discuss Russian President Vladimir Putin's visit to Vietnam, Singapore Prime Minister Lawrence Wong's visits to Malaysia and Brunei, and startling reports of a US-led anti-vaccine campaign in the Philippines. I'm Lauren Mai.
And I'm Japhet and Lauren. Today is June 27th, 2024. Happy 2 years in Southeast Asia Radio. This week, Greg and Elina are answering your questions to celebrate this milestone. Before that, let's start with our headlines.
We're starting today's podcast talking about oil.
How American.
Indeed. We're looking at Singapore this week, where a major oil spill has closed beaches across the city-state.
Oil slicks spread from Singapore's southern islands to Changi in the far east and even to beaches in Malaysia's southern state Johor. Last Friday, a Netherlands-flagged dredging boat lost control of its engine and steering. It crashed into a Singapore-flagged bunker vessel and caused 400 tons of fuel to leak into the sea.
Singapore's port authorities responded almost immediately to contain the spill, and a large majority of the oil deposits have been cleaned up in the weeks since.
Still, Singapore's authorities say it'll take some time before the oil is completely removed.
Meanwhile, an investigation is underway to identify the cause of this incident. Lawyers warn that criminal charges could result from the probe.
And Singapore's Maritime and Port Authority had said it will seek compensation for costs incurred from the spill from the owners of the dredging boat.
In the meantime, jiayo to those working on cleanups in Singapore and Johor.
Too soon, Lauren, too soon.
For our next story, we're looking at Thailand and Malaysia's interest to join BRICS.
BRICS is a group of emerging economies originally comprised of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa.
That's right. Malaysia announced that it would start its formal membership application soon. This decision came 3 weeks before Chinese Premier Li Qiang's visit to Malaysia to celebrate the 50th year of diplomatic relations between the two countries.
Like Malaysia, Thailand also expressed its interest to become a member of BRICS, expecting its bid to pass at the group's next summit in Russia in October.
Following Thailand and Malaysia's announcements, there are concerns that their membership may result in overdependence on China.
Fair point. So we'll have to keep an eye on how their membership bids progress over the next couple months.
Yes, definitely worth monitoring the BRICS summit in Russia for more developments. Speaking of Russia, President Vladimir Putin visited Vietnam last week.
Through his visit to Vietnam, Putin is seeking a security architecture for Asia aimed at resolving conflicts through peaceful means without closed military political blocs.
Putin claimed that sanctions from NATO pose a security threat to Russia in Asia, so this visit aims to prove that he still has friends in this region.
Vietnam's President To Lam praised Putin for contributing to peace, stability, and development in the world.
Putin also complimented Vietnam for its balanced stance on the Ukraine crisis and its non-interference policy.
Besides discussions on Ukraine, the two countries signed 11 cooperation documents in education, nuclear technology research, disease prevention, and oil exploration.
With Putin's visit, Vietnam now becomes the only Southeast Asian country to host state visits for leaders of China, the United States, and Russia, 3 world superpowers in the past year. I'm curious how the United States reacted to this visit.
The United States did not enjoy this development. The U.S. Embassy in Hanoi expressed its concerns about the implications of this visit, as Vietnam can be a platform for Putin to promote and normalize Russia's aggression in Ukraine.
Shortly after Putin's visit, Washington announced that Daniel Crittenbrink, Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, would visit Vietnam in the same week.
Washington also emphasized its commitment to deepen ties with Hanoi to ensure a free and open Indo-Pacific region.
Despite the U.S. reiterating its intentions to stay close to Vietnam, analysts believe that this could decrease Washington's trust in Hanoi.
As Hanoi is waiting for Washington to graduate Vietnam from its non-market economy status, Putin's visit may affect the U.S.'s decision, which is due by July 26th.
Putin is out, and Crittenbrink is in. We'll have to see how Hanoi navigates its way through great power politics.
We will. But for now, there's another world leader who went on a series of overseas trips in the region to mark their tenure, Singapore's new Prime Minister.
Right, I heard about that. Since taking office last May, Prime Minister Lawrence Wong visited Brunei and Malaysia over the course of 2 days.
In Brunei, PM Wong's delegation met with the Sultan Hassan al-Bolkiah to reaffirm their economic cooperation through the currency interchangeability agreement and Brunei's support in hosting training for Singapore's armed forces.
His next stop was in Malaysia, where he met with Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim to promote cross-sectoral cooperation and to discuss ongoing bilateral issues surrounding maritime and aerospace borders.
PM Wong described ongoing projects between the two countries as major game changers, citing the construction of a high-speed rail linking the two countries and the establishment of a special economic zone in Malaysia's Johor province.
The leaders acknowledged concerns surrounding water supplies and the designation of airspace in the flight information region. While negotiations have gone on for a long time, both leaders expressed optimism in resolving issues by the upcoming Singapore-Malaysia leaders' retreat.
Overall, the two visits set an optimistic tone for Singapore's relations with Brunei and Malaysia at the onset of Wang's tenure. And, to cap off our headlines, we'll be discussing shocking allegations of the Pentagon's anti-vaccine campaign in the Philippines during the COVID-19 pandemic.
According to Reuters, this US-led operation consisted of phony accounts impersonating local Filipinos. These accounts spread content undermining China's Sinovac vaccine during the pandemic, going so far as to disparage the quality of test kits and face masks from China.
The report was met with public condemnation, with several lawmakers expressing anger at the operation's implications for the Philippines' public health. During the pandemic, the Philippines had one of the worst inoculation rates in the region, resulting in countless COVID-19 related deaths.
The Pentagon's decision to stoke vaccination fears as a geopolitical maneuver is a troubling revelation indeed. As demands emerge for Filipino lawmakers to investigate the report's claims, we anticipate further inquiries into the U.S.'s involvement.
And those were our headlines. Did we miss anything? Be sure to write us about the topics you're interested in at searadio@csis.org, and we'll be more than happy to cover them.
Looking forward to hearing from you all. Coming up, our anniversary Q&A with Greg and Elina. Stay tuned.
Welcome back, folks. I'm Greg Poling with CSIS, joined by Elina Knorr of the Carnegie Endowment. Howdy, Elina.
Hey, Greg. Good to be back.
And today we have Japhet and Lauren Mai in studio to run the show. This is our second anniversary special, which means that Elina and I have done no prep and no real work. And we're going to turn it over to Japhet and Lauren to run the show. So over to you guys.
Thank you so much, Greg. Hi, everyone. Happy 2 years of Southeast Asia Radio. We have a bunch of questions that you all submitted that we will subject Greg and Elina to over the next couple minutes. We're going to divide this up into a bunch of different sections, starting with general Southeast Asia questions, geopolitical questions, sense of regional trends, followed with trade, country-specific questions. We'll also have some fun questions peppered in, so stay tuned for those. I'll hand it off to Lauren for our first round of questions.
Great. Thank you, Japhet. So the first question we have from our viewers is, what is the biggest misconception that DC policymakers make about Southeast Asia?
Greg, you want to go first? I'm still in shock that we're celebrating our 2-year anniversary.
I know. The podcast should be starting to talk. It's already walking. Now, let's see. Biggest misconception that there's a thing called a Southeast Asian position on anything, which in my experience, whatever somebody in DC says, Southeast Asia thinks X. It's probably because they just got back from a trip to Singapore, and that's what 8 people told them.
Or the Philippines. So as a corollary to that, I would say I agree completely, but I would also say that one of the biggest misconceptions I found about DC thinkers on Southeast Asia or DC visitors to Southeast Asia is that whatever DC observers say is welcomed in Southeast Asia. And that goes to Greg's point that the region speaks with one voice. And very often, you can go to one country and have many different voices, let alone different countries in Southeast Asia.
Okay, great. Thank you. On to our next question. How will the upcoming U.S. election impact America's foreign policy priorities in Southeast Asia? And how will it impact diplomatic engagement within the region?
Ugh. As the second question, really?
Sounds like a question for the American on this podcast.
You have spent as much time at American think tanks as I have, and you're the one who was actually an employee of the Department of Defense, not me.
Ouch. Right. That's a low blow, but okay.
All right. So if President Biden wins a second term, I think we will see no change on economic policy. I mean, we can all hope, but Catherine Tai or no Catherine Tai, I think President Biden is going to stick firmly with what he calls his trade strategy for the middle class, which is going to mean no real room for a trade strategy at all. But we will see the private sector continuing to do what they've been doing, which is deepen relations with the most important economies of the region as they seek to diversify supply chains. We might see a further acceleration of the deepening political and security engagement with the Philippines and to a degree with Vietnam, Singapore, and Indonesia. And I say might because a lot depends on what happens on the Hill, I think, but generally second-term presidents, at least people claim, focus more on foreign policy. And the reason people say that is because they tend to have lost whatever slim congressional majorities they may have had, so they can't do much on the domestic front. If it's Trump, Who knows? I can promise that we're going to go back to arguing over trade deficits. So that's bad news for Vietnam, whose trade deficit has continued to expand. It's bad news for Malaysia, Thailand. But I don't think Trump 2.0 is necessarily as bad for Southeast Asia as it's going to be for Europe or Northeast Asia. I think President Trump is probably going to spend as far as he does concern with foreign policy, he'll probably start with beating up on NATO and then move to beating up on Korea. He'll probably never really get around to beating up too much on the Philippines or others in Southeast Asia.
I think it also depends on the bureaucratic class. This, I don't think, matters so much whether it's the Biden administration or the Trump administration. It's only a matter of degrees, I think, between the two. Because assuming that many of the senior officials that we're now seeing in the Biden administration leave, granted, a lot of the relationships with Southeast Asian countries have been institutionalized through different means, we might see a change in focus depending on who sticks around or who replaces those senior officials if Biden stays in office. With Trump, really, it's anybody's guess. And I think Southeast Asian countries are prepared for that. I don't know, though, that a second Trump administration will be very like the first Trump administration. I would think it'll be a bit different. Just how different, I don't know. So basically, it's really a toss-up if President Trump comes back to office.
We should also add a lot of this, maybe most of it, is exogenous, completely outside of the control of the president, right? What does China do? What does Russia do? What does the war in Gaza look like? What is the global economy doing, right? These are the things that really drove the relative successes or relative failures of U.S. policy in Southeast Asia, at least since the first Obama administration. Some presidents have been better at seizing opportunities than others, but they didn't create those opportunities.
That's true.
Great. Thank you. Very informative. Now on to Japhet to kick off the geopolitics section.
Yes, and I think the geopolitics title is a bit of a misnomer because this is actually just the South China Sea section. So our first one here asks, what scenarios might unfold in the South China Sea between China and the Philippines over the next year? Do you see an end game?
Oh, I think barring any exceptional developments, we'll see more of the same. So we'll see more continued flashpoints, more tensions, probably more incidents at sea. I think the hope in and around Southeast Asia is that those incidents will not escalate to something much larger, drawing other countries in. I do think, though, that, again, this depends on who comes into the White House by next year. But I think there'll also be an expectation, and I've read a few commentaries calling for more solidarity by Southeast Asian nations with the actions of the Philippines. I don't know if that's going to be forthcoming. Remember also that Malaysia takes ASEAN chairmanship next year, and Malaysia is a claimant in the dispute. I doubt that the Malaysian government will go as far as Manila has gone in terms of staking its claim, not just for Malaysia, but for the other Southeast Asian claimants in the South China Sea. So I think we'll see more of the same, depending on all those different factors that I mentioned.
I don't think that there's any end game, at least not over the next year, but I do think there's a path through to a more stable status quo. That path is pretty risky because what it requires is the Philippines to successfully shore up the BRP Sierra Madre at Second Thomas Shoal, which, of course, it's been working very hard to do for now more than a year. Getting to a place where Manila feels confident in the stability of the shoal and an easy resupply. At the same time, the Philippine Coast Guard is going to continue to patrol Scarborough Shoal, which they've started for the first time in a decade, and stabilize that. If you can get to that, there's some other things that will, of course, have to happen. The Philippines will continue to build out patrol capabilities at other places in the Spratlys and so on. But I do think you could get through to a place where this kind of normalizes into a new, stable, admittedly tense status quo that could be managed for the intermediate term until probably Xi Jinping leaves office. and there's some willingness from a new Chinese government to negotiate in good faith. But otherwise, I mean, the name of the game is always going to be dispute management, not dispute resolution. The other thing is that no matter what happens, I think you're going to see continuing deepening of the Philippines' security relationships, not just with the U.S., but with Japan, Australia, France, Canada, New Zealand. I mean, it's starting to get hard to track just how many new security deals the Philippines has signed over the last year. And that's going to continue because the Philippines can't really expect much support from its neighbors.
I was going to say it was a very optimistic assessment, Greg, until you threw in that last sentence.
Okay, maybe they can expect more support from some of their neighbors, but the 2025 ASEAN chair isn't going to be one of them.
Thanks for that super detailed answer. That actually covers all of the questions we had. It was all South China Sea related information. We're moving right on to regional trends. Take it away, Lauren.
Yep. Thanks, Japhet. So the question we have is, now that we've gone through a number of elections this year in Southeast Asia and the last year as well, do we still think that populist leaders are on the rise in the region?
No. I'm not sure that that's the correct narrative. I mean, there was certainly the narrative that populism is on the rise globally, and that may or may not be true. But other than Duterte, I mean, despite what people might think, Marcos isn't a populist leader. Like, Marcos is small C conservative, backed by all the most wealthy and powerful families of the Philippines. You couldn't imagine a more establishment leader, really. And while people might argue that Prabowo's campaign was somewhat populist, dancing kawaii grandfather and all that, same thing. Prabowo is not he didn't emerge from obscurity to destroy the political establishment. He is the political establishment. So I don't see a lot of evidence of successful populism anywhere in Southeast Asia, barring the previous Duterte administration.
Yeah, I stayed silent for a bit because I think if we actually had a video on this podcast, you would see my eyebrows furrowed, which tends to happen a lot in general, but that's beside the point. And I agree with Greg that I'm not sure that that's the appropriate narrative. You think of Thailand, we've seen how those elections have played out. I agree with Greg's assessment on both Indonesia as well as the Philippines, but also just thinking about Cambodia as well. I'm not sure I would graft that populist picture onto the region. I think it's a very different story.
Great, thank you. On to our next question. How would you characterize the state of democracy within Southeast Asia? Is the region experiencing a period of democratic backsliding?
Elina, you start, because you're the one that thinks that 8 or 9 out of 10 ASEAN states are democratic, right?
I don't remember what I said anymore, but I actually have a problem with this phrase democratic backsliding. And I think it really depends on who you ask and what their interpretation of that phrase is. I think there are some concerns about the state of democracy generally defined in Southeast Asia, but that also speaks to the state of democracy generally around the world. And I'm not sure that Southeast Asia is very unique in that sense. I think if you ask a Southeast Asian who believes in, again, I'm generalizing, very Western conceptions of democracy, there might be real cause for concern, and they might agree with this term of backsliding. I think, though, if you ask other Southeast Asians, and I put myself in this category, I'm not sure that what we've been seeing is departure from previous years or decades, honestly speaking. And so I think it's just one of those ebbs and flows of how political governance has coursed through Southeast Asian modern history.
I'm more optimistic about the state of democracy and governance in the region than, say, a pure reading of Freedom House scores over the last decade would suggest. I mean, democracy is not an arrow that points in one direction. All democracies swing. It's a pendulum. You have reactions and counter reactions. We just saw that in the European election. We've seen it in the US for a couple of election cycles. What makes a democracy is not does it continue to march in some kind of platonic ideal of liberal democracy without any regression. It's does it bounce back, right? It's do institutions hold and allow for course correction so that most citizens are represented. By that metric, the Philippines remains a quite robust and consolidated democracy. I would argue that the survival of the system post Duterte is evidence that, in fact, it was maybe stronger than people thought. Indonesia remains a robust, healthy democracy, despite some diminution of civil and political freedoms that I won't deny. Malaysia is more democratic than it's ever been, despite unprecedented numbers of demands for takedown of TikTok videos by the Anwar government, or whatever metric you want to pick out. The current Thai government is certainly more representative than the military junta was for a decade. It's less representative than it would have been if Pita was allowed to form a government. I'm going to not get too deep into Thailand because I'm sure by the time this comes out, we're going to have a number of important court cases decided. I would go so far as to say that there are probably more citizens living in Southeast Asia today as a proportion of the overall regional population who have a representative government than has ever been the case before. Cambodia has become more authoritarian. Vietnam is in the middle of an authoritarian backlash. Certainly, Laos remains Laos, Brunei remains Brunei. But everywhere else, I mean, even Singapore, I would argue that the PAP is more adaptive and responsive than it's ever been to public demands, more accountable. And while Myanmar is in the grips of a horrendous civil war, the democratic opposition is clearly winning, and the junta is clearly losing.
Thank you both for such a great answer. We're now at the halfway point, which means it's time for our first fun question, which is, what was the most unexpected or shocking bit of news from the region in the last 6 months?
I'm supposed to remember news from 6 months?
Whatever shocked you, whatever stood out to you, maybe it could have been funny too.
I'm really scratching my head here.
I mean, if it had been like the last 18 months, I would have said Anwar being able to form a government was the most shocking. Certainly the one I didn't see. I saw Bong Bong coming. I saw Prabowo coming. I didn't see Anwar coming.
Is that yours? Oh,
I said it would have been. Now I have to think about something that actually happened last.
Oh, okay.
Since the beginning. Okay, it's probably, well, a couple things for me. I can't say Operation 1027 in Myanmar because it's been now 7 months and change. But the fall of Miyawadi, I think, took everybody by surprise. The speed which the Karen National Union was able to seize Miyawadi, even if they subsequently lost it and are now fighting for control of it. But it certainly spooked the Thai government and other regional governments, and I think has fundamentally changed the discussion about the war in Myanmar. It's made even the junta's former friends in the region realize that it probably can't win. The other one I would say that's been a slow burn, so people haven't been appropriately shocked, but I think we will be in hindsight, is the scale of the financial scandal unwinding in Vietnam, in which a businesswoman has probably engaged in the largest embezzlement in history. And the Vietnamese government is dumping, I've lost track, something like 5% of GDP or something into stabilizing Saigon Commercial Bank. Like, this is nuts, right? To dump that much money to float a single bank, and we're nowhere near the bottom of this scandal yet.
That's a good point. I was going to say that what I've been surprised by, but not necessarily shocked by, is how much of Indonesia's younger voter segment voted for Prabowo. And I guess if Marcos in the Philippines was any indication, that might not have been such a surprise to me. But I was still surprised by it. But I think, Greg, you're right. Probably by an order of magnitude, I was also surprised, bordering on shocked by what's been going on in Vietnam and how the corruption hunt has really turned scandalous with the amount of money that's been embezzled.
Yeah, and it's so shocking that we're not even talking about the fall of two presidents and chairperson of the National Assembly as being the most shocking thing to happen in Vietnam over the last year. We're talking about a private businesswoman having embezzled a not insignificant amount of national GDP.
Over many decades, yeah.
Okay. Heavier than we expected, but nonetheless, excellent answers. It'll be great for our listeners.
Upbeat, uplifting. I'm sorry.
We can take it.
Prabowo is at dancing is my answer. Is that a better
Sure, we are all shocked by how good of a dancer he is. I mean, I wonder how much of that is just the editing skills of his staff.
Such a cynic, Japhet.
All right, I'm going to float an idea for the next ASEAN summit in the fall. Here we are. New PM Lawrence Wong plays the guitar. New president Prabowo Subianto dances.
Oh my goodness. I would watch that. I would pay to watch that.
We would all watch that.
I'd enjoy that a lot.
And then everybody else has to show their hidden talents. It'll be like an ASEAN leader talent show.
There has to be durians as well somewhere.
That sounds great. All right, we're going to go into our last two categories, from trade to country-specific issues. For our trade question, it's for Elina. Our listener says, there's been a lot of excitement over AI innovation and governmental regulation in the past few years. As the region continues to invest in AI in the future, what are some key concerns that policymakers should be looking out for?
Oh, God, I can have a whole show on this. But okay, let me summarize this as succinctly as I can. So I think many people who've heard my tirade about how overly optimistic Southeast Asia is on AI will already know how I feel about this. But I think one of the concerns that has been glossed over in Southeast Asia related to any digital tech, particularly with AI, is we haven't really taken into sufficient consideration the political economic history of data, which feeds the whole AI transformation. There are a lot of really disturbing practices from the past that we've folded into AI governance and transformation that we haven't really looked at. I'm thinking of labor practices. I'm thinking of data extraction work that continues to exploit workers. So it's both on the data side as well as on the labor side that we're viewing extraction and exploitation that have been continued from past decades. And I don't think that we have fully considered our suite of options in terms of governance frameworks other than the ones that we have now. And by that, I mean, we should be looking at some really fresh scholarship that's beginning to emerge from other parts of the global majority, including in Africa and Latin America.
Great. Thank you so much. We'll move on to our country-specific questions. Here we have, how seriously should we take Chinese spy infiltration in the Philippines in context of the Alice Guo investigations and the like? It's been in the news quite frequently lately.
The Philippines certainly takes it seriously. This is a really hard one to answer because a lot of the stories that you hear coming out of the Philippines, certainly a lot of the commentary online and even within the halls of the Congress, at sometimes easily cross over into xenophobia in ways that are super unhelpful. That said, it's undeniable that China engages in concerted influence operations, espionage, and attempts at elite capture in the Philippines in particular, but in a lot of other places as well. Is Mayor Alice Guo a Chinese plant, or is she just super greedy and really, really bad at it? I tend to lean toward the latter. Like, I think a Chinese spy would be smart enough not to put her own name on the illegal Philippine offshore gaming operation that she's benefiting from. But maybe that's what they want you to think. Maybe it's a double fake, that she's actually such a good spy. She seems like an incompetent criminal. I don't know.
How many Netflix movies have you been watching that cover espionage and these kinds of drama, Greg?
Not enough. Not enough. We need like a version of The Manchurian Candidate film just in modern day Philippines.
Coming up.
I think it would be pretty well received. All right. Thank you. This one touches a little bit on what you mentioned earlier with the democratic forces in Myanmar being surprisingly adept at pushing back the junta. What do you see as the current state of it all? Do you think that Myanmar's civil war is set to end sometime soon? Is the junta reeling?
I mean, I think the junta is certainly getting a fight that maybe they weren't expecting. But assuming this trajectory continues, I think the more important question is what next, right? And we've covered some aspects of this in our previous podcasts on Myanmar. That's going to be a tough question for people in Myanmar to answer themselves, because they may seem united against the junta right now, but what happens with power sharing between all the different groups, different factions, but also different ethnicities, and what a reconstituted Myanmar would look like with or without the junta. I can't imagine. Actually, I don't know how you would even fold members of the junta back into a new Myanmar. That's going to be a really tough question, and I don't have the answer for that.
I agree, except I'm going to be even less definitive than Elina because I'm not prepared to say that there necessarily will be a reconstituted Myanmar. We can certainly hope so, but state fracture still seems just as viable an option as any other. And I mean, of course, the main actor here is the junta. How long and how brutally are they willing to fight what is, I think, ultimately a losing battle? And that's become very clear. And are they willing to throw Min Aung Hlaing overboard and maybe come to the table for a negotiation? And at what point? But the other main actor here is the National Unity Government. And so far, the NUG has failed to make the kinds of concessions that it would take to get the buy-in of most, certainly the critical mass of the ethnic armed organizations or ethnic resistance organizations. I use the terms without any loaded meaning. And so there's a window of opportunity here. I don't know how long it stays open, in which the NUG can, through mechanisms like the NUCC or others, convince enough of these groups that they're better hanging together than hanging alone. But if that window passes and, the Arakan Army, the KIO, the KNU, the KNPP, the two different competing Chin governments, if some of them decide that they're actually better off declaring formal independence, not just seeking autonomy, that seems like a viable option, something that we should consider. And if that does happen, they'll probably be the only effective governing institutions in the country. I also think that the U.S. needs to start getting creative about exactly that, thinking through exactly what that means. We take it as axiomatic that the fracturing of Myanmar, as we've known it since the end of World War II, would necessarily be destabilizing. It wouldn't be ideal by any means. But Myanmar, since World War II, has been a destabilizing force, period, because of the junta. Would its fracturing into multiple smaller states or governing entities necessarily be destabilizing? Most of these EROs never agreed to be part of this thing we call Myanmar, or used to call Burma. They didn't get a say, and they've been fighting against it for more than 80 years. Why should we begin from the premise that it would be illegitimate for the Karen, Karenni, various groups in Shan State, Arakan, Chin, etc., to seek formal independence rather than reconstitution into a unified Burma if they decide that the Bamar, as represented by the NUG, are not sincere in wanting a truly federal system?
Okay, thank you very much. On to our next question. In 2022, ASEAN admitted Timor-Leste, in principle, to become the 11th member of ASEAN, and Timor has stated since that they intend to be a full-fledged member of ASEAN by 2025. With 1 year left to go, is this goal still realistic? If so, why? If not, what would need to be done?
So Timor-Leste has been on this pathway to full membership since 2022. And I think it's received overwhelming support for full inclusion as a member, with maybe some hesitation by one or two, really one party. I think its eventual membership is almost a foregone conclusion if it's able to meet the conditions that's been set for it. And, to be fair, I agree with Timor-Leste officials. They've been set conditions that go far and beyond conditions that were set for previous members seeking inclusion into the ASEAN Club. And if ASEAN has always considered itself to be an inclusive organization, I can't understand why there's been so many stumbling blocks put in Timor-Leste's way to seek admission. I understand it intellectually, but I think really Timor-Leste has been dealt quite an unfair hand here.
I take no moral position on how fair the conditions are set. I will note that ASEAN, as it's constituted today, is a far more dense organization than it was during the expansion of the 90s, right? Cambodia didn't have an expectation that it would have to meet hundreds of times every year and have line ministries that could effectively negotiate hundreds of meetings every year, or that it would have to ratify dozens and dozens of agreements that have been made by ASEAN, most of them in the last 25 or 30 years. So I think there's valid reasons that the expansion today should be more difficult than it was in the 90s. But I do think Timor-Leste is fair to say that this needs to happen relatively quickly, and that it can't be a half measure, right? Timor-Leste can't be granted some kind of junior membership in perpetuity because others don't feel it's ready.
Great. So on to our final question for the country-specific section. What's Indonesia's geopolitical situation since the election of Prabowo, and what do you forecast for Prabowo's foreign policy?
At this point of recording, I think it's too early to say. I do agree with many other commentators. There will probably be an extension of Jokowi's foreign policy, but I think Prabowo is going to be a more hands-on president than Jokowi has been in his 2 terms. And so I think we'll see a more, not necessarily interventionist foreign policy from Jakarta, but I think definitely a more interested approach to foreign policy making by President Prabowo when he comes into office officially. I think it will also depend on the constitution of his cabinet. I do foresee a very pro-business, pro-investment type foreign policy, so more heavy on the economics of foreign policy making. I think we'll just see more involved Indonesia on the world stage, hopefully.
Yeah, I think that's right. Prabowo clearly is more of an internationalist, not an interventionist, than Jokowi, who's notoriously at times wonder why he even has to show up to ASEAN meetings, much less all the other meetings that detract him from his domestic agenda. But anybody in Washington or Beijing who thinks there's going to be some kind of fundamental realignment of Indonesian policy is going to be sorely mistaken. Indonesia is going to remain the bebas dan aktif, free and active foreign policy has been embedded in the Indonesian elite strategic DNA since independence. It's not going to change. Prabowo will lean one way or another on specific issues based on what he deems to be Indonesia's national interest.
Great. Thank you both so much for answering all of our questions today, but we can't let you go without one last silly question. If you remember the holiday special from a couple months ago, we discovered that of all the people on the Southeast Asia program and AMTI team to be an elf, it was Andreka. This time, the question is a bit simpler, I guess, but of AMTI and SEAP, who has the best podcasting voice?
Has every member of AMTI in Southeast Asia been on the podcast? You and Lauren
Yes.
are on a lot. Andreka's been on.
And Monica and Harrison have been on.
For the holiday special?
If we're counting Pacific Airwaves as part of the Southeast Asia Radio Pacific Airwaves expanded universe or something like that.
That's such a subjective question.
I can't help that this is what our listeners have sent in.
Who has the best podcast voice? Karen Lee, because she's no longer here and I don't have to answer to her.
You do have to answer to all the others, though, Greg.
Lauren, can you give us like a do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do? One of those? And then Japhet, you do the same thing, or
That'll hurt your ears. I'm not going to do that for you.
I would agree. It would also
rain
hurt your ears
in
from me.
Spain falls mainly in the plain, something like that. That we
This
can
is
test.
turning out to be a Southeast Asia Radio Got Talent kind of show.
All right, Elina, neither of them are actually in your program, so you can cut to the bone. Go ahead.
I don't have a favorite. I mean, like I said, it's such a subjective one, so I'm not going to answer that. I'm not going to be entrapped.
Elina told me off air it's Lauren.
I can deny
Water.
that would ever happened. You're always my favorite, Japhet.
I can't believe you would say
Thanks
that,
to
Lauren.
Elina. Spreading discord among the Southeast Asia team like that.
Exactly.
Disinformation to create splintered unity. Well, thank you all so much for answering our audience's questions, and happy 2 years of Southeast Asia Radio.
Woohoo!
I guess if you want us to keep doing this, we will. We'll see you in a year.
See you in a year.
Bye.
Thanks again for joining us for this episode of Southeast Asia Radio. Feel free to write us with any comments, questions, or feedback at searadio@csis.org. We'll get back to you.
Do us a favor and subscribe and give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever streaming platform that you listen to us on. Tell your friends about us.
Marla Hiller is our producer, and our interns are Tappy Lung, Zhang Pham, and Amelie De Leon. Our co-hosts today were Greg Poling and Elina Noor. My name is Japhet Kitson.
And I'm Lauren Mai.
And we'll see you in 2 weeks for the next season of Southeast Asia Radio.